Hello everyone. I'm standing outside this beautiful building in the heart of Derry on this sunny day. I'm here to introduce our ISL Heritage Project video funded by DFC, the Department for Communities, so recognition to them for that. The project is about our ISL deaf community and their memories throughout the years of growing up, school, home, family and work. It comprises short videos from deaf people who live in the whole of Northern Ireland. My memories of school. I went to school in Dublin. My parents wanted me to be educated in Dublin, but the Education Board said no and advised them to send me to Jordanstown School in Belfast, as it would be better for me, and that the Dublin system of education was the oral system plus sign language, and that would impede my career prospects in the future. Plus, it was relevant for a deaf child from Northern Ireland to attend school within the UK. So, my parents looked into this and consulted with past pupils both from Belfast and Dublin, and upon deliberation decided they preferred Dublin School for me, but the Education Board refused. Fortunately, my uncle was a Sinn Féin MP, and he agreed to lend his support to overturn the board's decision. So, we were all called to a hearing at the headquarters of the Education Board in Bangor. There was myself, my mother, father, my uncle, all at the hearing. It was a very official event, and at the time I was only aged 8, but my education was already delayed as a result. Their application had already been turned down twice, despite my uncle writing to them to challenge their decision. So after much heated arguments and debate, eventually the board relented and permitted me to attend school in Dublin. It wasn't a momentous occasion for my family to achieve their wishes. I remember going to school in Dublin and seeing everybody using sign language for the first time. It was a hard life. I grew up in Belfast. I don't know what age I was when my parents found out I was deaf. I was sent to St Mary's School in Dublin when I was 3. I didn't get home at holiday times at first. Not Christmas, summer or Easter. But in the fullness of time, I was allowed to go home for the holidays. My education mostly consisted of religion. This religious education was taught by the minister and the teachers. There wasn't standard subjects taught like English. It didn't matter what the weather was, whether it was fine or raining. The routine was the same every day of the week until I left school. I was very homesick and I missed my friends. What school did you go to? I went to the old Cashel School. Where's that? About a mile away from my home at the time. What about yourself, Mary? What school did you go to? I went to St Anne's Primary School. Same as me, I went there. I remember it was oral and sign language wasn't allowed. Yes, it was oral for me too, and then I was moved to Cabra School in Dublin, St Mary's. Yes, I was too. It was for me as well. I attended a few partial hearing units. How did you learn sign language? In Derry, some of the boys could sign BSL basically, and they taught me. It was more like gestures, it was very different. But what about ISL? I learned ISL before that. I learned the alphabet. But where did you learn it? In Derry. Really? You learned ISL in Derry? I didn't learn ISL until I went to Dublin. I remember being able to use ISL secretly so the teacher couldn't catch me. I learned ISL at Dublin School. What age were you when you first went to Dublin School? Well, at age 5, I went to St Anne's, and that was oral education. And then deaf school when I was 10, and that's where I learned to use sign language. I was 10 too. I was 14 and a half. How did you feel when you first went to Dublin School? I froze. My parents took me to meet the nuns. Same for me. And we were all different ages. Did you communicate with my parents and understand what they were saying? They had no experience of deaf people. I remember explaining sign language to my mother, and from then on, we were able to communicate. My father, mother, aunt, and myself all caught the train to Dublin. That was my first time going to Dublin School. It was September 1948. I remember approaching the building. It was beautiful. I thought it was a museum. It was great. I remember following my parents in, and then they were gone. I was so upset and I cried. What age were you? I was 5 years old. I'm deaf, and I attended Beach Park School from age 3 to 8. It was good there, and the nuns took great care of us. The food was lovely, everything was good. But then when I was 10, I was moved to St Joseph's Secondary School in Dublin. It was run by the clergy and the Christian Brothers. The experience was awful. The food was terrible, but we did learn different subjects like woodwork, metalwork, art, English, etc. Life as a boarder there was awful. I grew up in the country. I think I was 3 when my parents found out that I was deaf. I didn't realise I was deaf as my parents were able to communicate me, despite not knowing anything about deafness. Then, when I was 5, I was taken to school in Dublin in 1954. We caught the train, and it was the first time in my life to even see a train. I was used to living in a small area. We departed from Victoria Bridge, and from there we travelled to Portadown, where we changed trains. That was where I was collected by a social worker who escorted me the rest of the way. I said goodbye to my parents. We had passed the Belfast on the way and changed trains. Then when we arrived in Dublin, it was so big. We got the bus then to school. I was taken aback by the journey and all the new things I could see. Then, when we arrived, I remember looking at the old school building. It was big and eerie, like a house of horror. I remember the Christian brother coming to meet me and telling me to bring my things and carry them up the stairs to the dormitory. I had to lug all my stuff up 3 flights of a spiral staircase. There was no lift. No lift? No lift. Just a spiral staircase. How many flights? 3. Oh yes, I remember that. Yes, 3. What about you? Yes, I remember. I was so upset leaving my parents and having to go to school in Dublin. I was very distressed, but I just had to get on with it. There were many other children there, most of them a lot taller than me, but they were all heights and all ages. It was a great time using sign language, and I remember learning to speak. It was 1967. Similarly, I remember the journey to school. I was about 5. My grandmother and my aunt took me by car from Belfast. I remember the journey and arriving at this great big building. I asked if it was a hospital, but they told me no, it was school. It did look beautiful, and the Christian brothers showed me around. And when I came back, my family were gone. I had a small case, and I remember seeing sign language for the first time. I was so upset and anxious because my parents were away. I was taken into a room and they told me everything would be okay. And then I saw there were other people signing to me, but I was frozen. I didn't know sign language before. The Christian brother told me it would be fine, but it really felt like I'd just been admitted to a hospital. Yes, it was the same for me. I felt so uncared for and repeatedly told to stop crying. I cried every day. I was born deaf, and I have a twin brother who could hear. Now, over the passage of time, I was sent to school at age 7. It was a mainstream school. However, it was decided that I needed to leave. So my father was looking for an appropriate school for me, and he found a deaf school, and it was Cabra School in Dublin. I was born in Newry, a deaf child. I was first sent to mainstream school, and that was in the countryside. I can still remember the narrow road up to the school. Then when I was 8, I got moved to a different building. It was a big building. I liked it. The other building hadn't been suitable for me. So I carried on there until I was 9.5. And then one day, the dentist came to do checkups at the school. So they were checking all the children, and when it was my turn, they realised that I couldn't hear and that I was the only deaf child there. My parents didn't know this. So the dentist beckoned me to follow her and took me. And it turned out we arrived at my home. The dentist went in and broke the news to my mother that I was deaf. And she was so shocked and cried. I didn't know what all this meant, and I was trying to figure out why all the tears. So that was the end of my time at mainstream school. Following that, I was packed off and my granny and parents took me to Dublin to this large building, which was deaf school. A new Christian brother came to our school in 1955 and visited the dormitory. We were divided up into groups. There was 3 groups, and I was in the 3rd one. Do you mean the room you slept in? Yes. Yes, I was in the 3rd group. Obviously, it was a late age for me, but I was sensible enough, thank God. My family had left, and I saw other children using sign language, and I picked it up easily. I left school when I was 15 and a half because of the government in Belfast. I wasn't pleased, as I wanted to learn more at Dublin. The nuns signed to me. I wasn't in the oral group. They taught me the alphabet, and we copied things down from the board, and that was how we were educated. I was born deaf, but it wasn't realised until a late age. My parents had no idea, but it was noticed that I wasn't responding to sounds. So I was taken to the doctor, who confirmed that I was indeed deaf. It came as a result of rubella. From age 1.5 until I was 10, I was not exposed to sign language. I went to a mainstream school in Belfast, St Francis de Sales, on the Falls Road. Sign language was not used. It was the education method. It was oral. I did not know sign language at all. Also, I didn't know about British Sign Language or Irish Sign Language or anything. I never gave these things any attention. When I reached the age of 11, it was time to transfer to secondary school. The options were Jordanstown, England, or Dublin. So my parents picked Dublin. I can't remember why they chose there. We went to visit it, and it began from there. My parents drove me. I was very apprehensive. It was a big place. I can remember being very nervous at the sight of this big dark building. I was imagining Dracula living there. My parents took me in and made a hasty farewell, and I was left with the Christian brother who took me in. I was very upset and emotional. I think I had separation anxiety. I remember being taken up 3 flights of spiral stairs to the dormitory. It was so strange, as I'd only ever slept on my own or shared with my sister, and here I was with all these beds. I hadn't yet been introduced to any of the other pupils because they were in class, but when class finished, I met them and I was completely unaware of sign language. They were asking me all these questions like what was my name and where was I from, and I couldn't respond as I didn't know how to. When they gestured to me where I was from, I spelt the word Belfast, using my fingers to draw out the letters in the air. And then they immediately signed the word Belfast to me using ISL. I thought, oh, so that's the sign for that. It was the same with my name. I spelt it out the same way, but I hadn't yet been given a name in sign language. Then I saw some faces that I knew from school in Belfast, and I realised they could now use sign language. They said don't worry, that they would help me. And I got introduced to others from the north. They were from Derry, Fermanagh, Tyrone, all over. I couldn't sign at all, everything was new to me. But within about 4 weeks I learned to fingerspell, and then everything from there came naturally. What school did you go to? I went to Dublin School. What age did you start? I was about 4.5. I remember the other children, and I was very upset leaving home. I was taken there by ambulance. Ambulance? Yes. Time passed. I was about 8 to 10 when they told me I was lazy, not using my voice. Oh dear, that was awful, putting you down like that. Yes. And then they put me into a group that used sign language. It was very daunting, and I was mixed in with the older girls. I remember being so upset and crying all the time about it. But I had to get on with it. I'm sure you were terrified being in with an older group. I was. I cried and cried. I said I wanted to go back to the other group, but they told me that I couldn't, and they assured me that I would learn sign language, and I did. It took a little time, but I got there, and eventually I felt much happier. I started school in Dublin when I was 11. I remember you. You were about 5. My father knew your family well. You had lovely black hair and brown eyes, so adorable. Daddy said the signing group wouldn't be doing examinations, but you were learning to read and write. I was placed in the oral group, however, and you were in the signing group. I recall the emphasis on lip reading and mouth patterns. At home we talked fast, but then it occurred to me it was different in school because everybody was deaf. Do you remember Mass every day? Yes. I remember we had to say the rosary. Yes, the rosary, every day, Monday to Friday at 4. Up at 6:30 to make the beds, then Mass at 7, then back to finish making the beds. Mass every day except for Saturday. I remember you having a colour of school uniform. Yes, white blouse, green jumper, red checked skirt. Mine was a green jumper with a cream blouse. Do you remember the priest saying Mass with the nun lip speaking? I remember looking behind me and seeing your group and the nun smacking me in the face and telling me I wasn't allowed to look, but I couldn't resist watching sign language, which I found fascinating. What age did you start school? From 4 years of age, I attended a partial hearing unit in Omagh. Were you the same? I started school at 4. I went to Jordanstown in Belfast. It was deaf school. We used ISL there. Oh, well, from the age of 4 to 11, I attended a partial hearing unit, which was the oral education. I had some home sign language, and the other pupils copied my signing. And the teacher, of course, used the oral system. We weren't allowed to sign, but we did secretly. Then when I was 11, I moved to St Mary's School in Dublin. Did you go there? Yes, but I attended Jordanstown, which was where I was very happy. It was a big school and I loved my class. The house mother was responsible for looking after us, as it was a boarding school. But she could be cruel. The care wasn't great there. And when I went home, I was often sick and withdrawn. And my mother, who was a qualified nurse, realised it must have been to do with the school. Initially going to school, I was very upset and cried my eyes out. I had to get the train. My parents couldn't afford a car or anything then. Oh, we had very different experiences. I was then moved to a different school. It was a PHU in Coleraine, which they used the oral system. The class had various ages, and I had to learn through lip reading. Imagine sign language first and then oral. I know. I wasn't settled at that school, and then when I was 12, I got moved to secondary school, and I was the only deaf person there. I couldn't communicate with them, and my confidence plummeted. I remember being shown around, and the teacher took me into my class and told the children that I was deaf and I would be joining their class. When she was leaving, she said bye-bye, and I said it too, and the whole class burst out laughing. They thought I'd said baby. It was the most horrendous experience. That shattered my confidence. I wanted to go back to sign language, as the oral system obviously wasn't working for me. So that was when I was moved to St Mary's in Dublin when I was 13. Initially to no avail, as I was put in the oral grip again. I was exhausted trying to communicate. It was such a struggle. Sign language was used in St Mary's, and I was moved in eventually to group 9. It was a hard time I can remember. I can imagine. I moved to St Mary's when I was 11. I was in the oral class for 2 years. It was hard work, to be honest. When I was at primary school, the class was mixed ages, but in secondary school we were separated into age groups, and it was realised that I was behind. My art teacher realised that my literacy was almost non-existent, and then 7 of us were moved to the deaf and dumb school. I was moved away from my friend group, which made me very upset. Also, I had to take care of some other children in the class who were disabled or had learning difficulties. However, my literacy skills did improve, thankfully, because of sign language. I did feel aggrieved having to be moved, but the teachers thought we would have an effect on the oral group by not being moved. I was in the same boat. Group 9 was the sign language group, and there was one person in my class the house mother made me look after. They were disabled, and always on the bus to and from home I was responsible to look after them because they had a bag on, which was a big responsibility from the age of 14 to 17. I was born deaf, and when I was 3, I started school in Jordanstown, Belfast. Back then, I didn't know anything about sign language. Initially, it was very difficult for me to settle in and get my bearings, but over the years, I got used to it, and I stayed there until I was 14. When I was 16 years of age at the Deaf Club, that was my first exposure to Irish Sign Language. I had always only known BSL. I'd never seen ISL before, and now at the Deaf Club in Omagh, this other language was being used. I thought there was always only one sign language in Ireland. Nobody ever told me about this, and I was astonished when I found out there was another school in Dublin, and all along there were 2 signed languages in Ireland. I very quickly picked up ISL, which is a beautiful language, and I have to say I became more fluent in it than BSL. I can still use both languages, but because ISL is the more dominant language in the Omagh area, I use ISL more. Honestly, I thought there was only one sign language in all of Ireland, but all along there was 2. Now, Omagh, Enniskillen and Derry are mostly bilingual deaf areas. Both BSL and ISL are used, but in Belfast they use BSL, and in Dublin they use ISL, and then in between there are pockets of bilingualism. Oh, it's useful to know both languages. Did you do religion at school? No, I attended Jordanstown School in Belfast. There was no mass. I didn't know any prayers. There was a Protestant service. Then, when I was about 8 or 9, I had to prepare to make my first Holy Communion at home. and then eventually I got confirmed. I didn't know any prayers or anything, and when I moved to St Mary's School it was quite the opposite, because there was a lot of religion and I didn't understand anything they were saying. And when they were saying the rosary, it was very embarrassing because I didn't have a clue. It wasn't your fault. It was the system that let you down. What about you? Well, as I said, I went to a partial hearing unit and I got prepared for First Holy Communion there. I didn't really understand what was going on. I did have to endure Mass with my parents. I remember sitting there, not having a clue what was going on. Then, when I went to St Mary's School, because it was run by the nuns, it was very religiously orientated. There was a few times we had religion classes that was Tuesday, and then it changed to Bible every Thursday, and then there was Mass, and that continued until I left school. When you got up in the morning there were prayers, and then at 12 o'clock there was the Angelus. Yes, in the morning there were prayers in the big old building, but when we moved there wasn't. It was just like home. There weren't prayers, we just had breakfast. I thought there should have been, but there wasn't. I started school when I was 4. Oh, 4, okay. My mum and dad took me to Cabra. I hadn't a clue what was going on. When we arrived, someone said hello. I didn't really understand what they were saying, I just stood there. Was it the same for you? Were you the only deaf person in your family? Yes. Same here. I was born deaf, and I didn't use sign language at school. I was educated orally. Could you already talk? No, I didn't speak. I was 3, I think, when my parents realised that I wasn't responding to sound, and they decided to send me to deaf school in Dublin when I was 5. I stayed there until I was 17. We were separated into different groups. There was the deaf sign language group, the group with deaf speech, the partial hearing group, and those who were being educated orally. I did sign though with the signers, in secret. Were you the same? Yes. I could lip read a bit, but I was in group 1. I know my parents were worried about me, but when I got home in the summer they were pleased to see that I was starting to talk. Maybe they thought it would be better for you to be able to speak. I remember arriving at Cabra School and I saw sign language for the first time. I looked to my dad because I didn't know what was going on, but he thought it would be a great way for me to learn. Then a Christian brother called me over, and I was wondering where my daddy had gone, but he'd actually left. I can remember I gave a kick because I was so annoyed and upset that we didn't get saying goodbye. A bigger deaf pupil guided me in. I was so scared. There were all these children signing. It was so much to take in. And when I went to bed, I was so scared and I couldn't sleep. So I climbed up to look out the window. And I was looking, wondering what had just happened. The others were nice to me and told me it was okay and to try to get to sleep. Then I started to learn the alphabet and sign language. It was hard to try to get your dexterity because I wasn't used to it and I was stiff. But through practice and time, it came to me naturally, and it was great to know sign language. Back home, I had no contact with deaf people. Zero. I found myself living in the hearing world. I did my best to learn how to lip read to communicate and eventually got a job with the help of a small community organisation. The job didn't require any formal qualifications. Moving forward, I worked in England for 6 years, then Dublin for 4 years, and then back to Belfast where I worked on the roads. I got that job because of a mainstream community group who helped me with the process. Looking back, I was mostly immersed in hearing world, which means now I can be flexible with both worlds. My education was very different when I compare schools from Belfast to Dublin. The system was a big adjustment for me. Trying to write things down from the board was very testing. It was evidence I was not near the stage I should have been, but fortunately learning sign language helped me to catch up. Then in October, I went into hospital with appendicitis, which led to me being off for 4 weeks. In turn, I missed classes and fell behind again. When I returned to school in November, I did my best to catch up, but overall my education was not at standard. However, school life with my friends was great. The camaraderie, sport, chatting using sign language, playing pool was so enjoyable. Academically, I wasn't too bothered. I did like subjects like geography and maths, but other subjects I didn't really pay much attention. I travelled to and from school by train, home on Friday and back on Sunday. That time of my life was a dual experience. There were good times and bad times. After school, I was immersed in the hearing world. My parents and family were all hearing, and the lack of communication started to affect my confidence. I remember feeling very tetchy, which was coming through in my behaviour. I was so frustrated, and my overall well-being was negatively impacted on because of being deprived of visual language. I was lucky because my class were doing junior cert, which is exams. My teacher wanted our sign language group to sit the junior cert, but the principal was against the idea. The teacher insisted, stressing the importance of providing the chance, and she held her ground, which meant we were allowed. Actually, I achieved a higher grade than the oral group, which is clear evidence of deaf people doing better using a visual language. I was so chuffed with myself, I remember feeling yes, despite suffering taunting from the other group. When I got the results, I came out on top. We were all set to leave school, and it hit us that now would be exposed fully to the hearing world. The principal wanted us to remain and do the leaving cert, which would be the equivalent to A levels in Northern Ireland. There was myself and another girl from Northern Ireland, and for us to stay to do the leaving cert meant we would continue at school until we were about 21. In Northern Ireland, A levels would be completed at 18, and we did not want to remain at school any longer. I came home into the hearing world, and my mother insisted I should enrol for a college course. Honestly, I strenuously did not want to go to college, but I had to. And there I was, the only deaf person in the whole place. What about yourself? When I left school, my pathway wasn't clear. My mother made inquiries to find out what was available for disabled people and what opportunities I might have. We met with someone who worked in this field, and it transpired there was a training centre in Dungannon for people with disabilities. That time the term used was handicapped. It was called Parkinor. Now, we didn't have a car, so my aunt offered to drive me. I remember arriving at what looked like an old castle. When I went in there, some deaf people were there. There was people with disabilities and people in wheelchairs. I was a bit out of my comfort zone. One man who worked there was deaf, and there was a female staff member as well, and they were both using Irish and British Sign Language, which put me on the back foot. My first sign language when I was young was ISL, but it was a long time since I'd used it, and I'd quite forgotten it. Thankfully, it did come back to me in time. I learned typing, English was out of the question, cooking and sewing. I stayed there for a year, but I didn't achieve academically as I had missed too much and there were no interpreters at that time. After then, I came home and went to work as a machinist in a factory. My education achievements were very poor. At school, there was no opportunity to learn English to an acceptable level or any other academic subjects. The Christian Brothers placed a total emphasis on religion, mass, prayers, etc. I felt okay with my experience at school. I didn't have any problems. When I left school at 16, my father insisted I must go to the job market and look for a job. I got a trial working as a machinist in Belfast. After the trial was completed, after 6 weeks, I got the job based in Dunmurry. After a few years, we were cut to a 3-day week and a lot of people lost their jobs. The result was a drop in wages. Then the organisation ISL, which was employment support for blind and deaf people, got me a job. It was good and the money wasn't bad. I was happy enough there. And I met a man who became my boyfriend. Unfortunately, my parents were not happy that he wasn't deaf, and at the age of 20 they put me out of the house. That in turn led to subsequent problems between us, and I never was close to my parents after then. To be honest, that was the end of our relationship. Back then there was nothing in terms of a decent education. Absolutely nothing. People who could hear had a standard education and achieved qualifications, but for us, sadly, there was no educational opportunities at all. Yes, that's right, compared to those who could hear, there was nothing for us. I remember when I was young and at school, maybe 14 or 15, I loved school and was a strong sign language user. One Christian brother asked us what we wanted to work at when we left school, and I said I wanted to be a jockey, I wanted to race horses, and that I was suitable being slim and all. The Christian brother said, "Oh no, you can't, you need a job that's suitable for deaf people." But another job had never occurred to me. Then he asked what our parents did, and I said, "Well, my uncle works with shoes." "There you go," he said, "you should work as a shoemaker." I protested and said I didn't want to. It was a dirty job, I wanted something that was clean. Anyway, I was put in the shoe workshop and I stuck it about a month. I hated it. The teacher was deaf and he told me deaf people were skilled at shoemaking and would help me to hold the nails in my mouth to stick the soles to the shoes. It was gross. I did not want to be there. And eventually I did get moved to the sewing workshop, but before that I tried my hand at joinery. But anyway, that was no good because I messed everything up I tried to do. So I went to the sewing and it seemed like a fine job. It suited me. It was nice. It was peaceful. I made various items of clothing. Things were okay. I wouldn't say I was mad about it, but I stuck with it for a year until I left school. Yes, that's right. I remember preparing for work after school and I was in the sewing department. I enjoyed it, all the different methods of sewing. It was grand. But a boy from the shoe workshop passed by and teased me. I was mad. It was humiliating. Being annoyed, I decided I better move to the shoe workshop. I had my male ego to uphold. One guy there, his nickname was Frankenstein. Oh, he was a tough nut, but very clever. He told me I was getting it wrong, as the soles weren't being stuck on properly. So I thought about it and I came up with this idea. I decided I was going to bring in a tyre and practice on it. So I went to practice on the tyre, but it wasn't as clever as I thought it was going to be because the nails shot all over the place. It was very tough to get the nails into the shoes through the sole. I'll tell you what, your thumb was in jeopardy. I was in the shoe workshop too. I learned how to stick the soles onto the shoes, and that was mainly what I did. I did that for a while. And then when I left school, I went to work in a training centre. That was in Dungannon, and it was for disabled people, or handicapped as they were known at that time. And I was the only deaf person there at the beginning. It was good. It was called Parkinor, and I stayed there for 10 years. I worked in a sewing place for 4 years, and I got so fed up there. It was a hearing place, and I always got dumped the rubbish jobs, like putting zips into garments. They had to be washed first, and then the zip had to be fitted. It was all very tricky work, and they didn't want to do it. So I walked out. I went to see the priest, and then he went with me to the workplace. And they said I shouldn't have walked out. And I explained I hadn't been happy and was sick of being the butt of their ignorance on the shop floor. And he apologised because he knew what I meant. So that was why I left. Yes, Belfast seemed to be okay for deaf people, but in Derry there was very little. Shoe work was all. We were definitely discriminated against due to hearing people's ignorance. It was a painful blow to be so ardent and excited to be leaving school and going into the big world and finding out the cruel reality. The language barrier was dreadful. I felt lost and helpless due to communication difficulties. How I got a decent job was thanks to the priest. We talked about it in the deaf club, and he did his best to guide me and found an employer. They asked for my credentials, and the priest explained I didn't have any qualifications as a result of my poor education. But they agreed to take me on a trial basis, and that was my way in. At St Joseph's the education was very good. We did subjects like joinery, metalwork, etc. It was no problem to me. We lived there, we had our meals, we played. The Christian brothers beat us and that wasn't good, but the teaching was good. 100%, no problem with that. I stayed there for 6 years. I left when I was 17. That was about 1990. They wanted me to stay another year, but there was no way. I had had enough. I wondered about a career and thought about joinery, and I got in a scheme called YTP, Youth Training Programme. Everybody on the programme was hearing, and it was a massive shock. I had left school where we could use sign language, and now I was back to square one, learning how to communicate with them. My recent life had been great communicating in sign language, and now it was the opposite. It hit me hard, but I had to fight to get through it, using gestures and writing things down. Then a deaf person suggested getting in touch with NIDYA, Nydia. There was a man there, Malachi, and Colette, and others, and they invited me to their Friday night club. I remember going along and seeing everyone using sign language, but it was BSL. So I had to start all over yet again and learn BSL. Now I am bilingual, first learning ISL and then I would say BSL by the time I was 17. It's useful to have both. There were so many barriers to employment. I really wanted joinery work but was never successful. They thought I couldn't because of my deafness. Then luckily I got some experience working. It was a family who had a deaf brother, and they took me on. I enjoyed it, but in my heart I wanted to be a joiner. To work with people, build up relationships, help and support them was my passion. I had different jobs, but not in Belfast. I worked in England on 2 occasions. I worked in Manchester with deaf children who had special educational needs. For example, learning difficulties, autism, behavioural issues, the whole spectrum. And with each one, it brought their own challenges. For me, every day was like a school day, but it was a great experience. It helped me develop new skills. Back then, there was an excessive amount of religion every day. Going to Mass, it was really overboard. I had to do a lot of cleaning. I did some sewing, but mostly I had to clean to a punishing degree. No pocket money, no going out in the evening. The bedrooms had to be kept. The weekends were a repeat of the week. It was the same routine all over again. I never got to go home. A few weeks after I left school, my mother mentioned me getting a job as I needed money. With her help, I soon started working in a shirt factory. As a machinist, it was great. I made some friends with hearing people. It was a big learning curve. I have lovely memories of that time. I remember teaching them the alphabet and sign language, and it must have been catching, as it soon spread. Did you work when you left school? Yes. At school I was so distressed. I told my best friend I wanted my mother to know how much I wanted to go home. Then I got a job in a factory, and I liked it. It was a challenge trying to communicate. We used to write things down. I got there eventually. The wages were okay. It worked out about £15 a week. I got a job working with my uncle, making women's garments. Then my brother told me there were deaf people working in a shoe factory. There was 4 of them. So I tried to get a job and expecting to get an interview. They told me I could start straight away, the next morning. The deaf there taught me sign language. I was aged 20, which was quite late. Then I went to the deaf club and I was shocked. The deaf people there were signing differently. So I asked at work why they taught me differently, and they said because I'd been educated the oral way. However, it wasn't long until I was signing in the ISL structure. I've been teaching now for a long time and I love it. I didn't get a decent education at school. It was no good at all, just the same repetitive routine every day. School wanted me to stay on for exams, leaving cert, but I lived in the north. I wanted home. I knew I would achieve better at home because school was so difficult, having to lip read everything. There was no communication support at that time. It was exhausting. The eye strain and concentration wore me out. Being home was much better. As I said, my education was poor. I just wanted to go home and find a job. I was homesick and happy to be back home. I felt at home as I have 4 deaf brothers and I could easily communicate with them. Oh, 4 brothers. Did you use the same sign language? No. For example, their days of the week are 2-handed and my days of the week are 1-handed. Yes, I remember being corrected using the word every. Their sign was different to mine, but I used the female version of ISL. My first job when I was 15. It was my father's brother who got me a start working in a kitchen factory. He put in a word with the boss and I got the job. We communicated using gestures. I worked there until I was about 20, and because I was communicating using lip reading and ways that suited them, my sign language dwindled. After that, I had many different jobs in the hearing world, and then going to the deaf club, I regained my sign language again. After school, getting a job was no mean feat, being deaf. Eventually I got a job working on the roads. I enjoyed it. It was challenging working with hearing people. We all felt awkward, but soon we got there. I taught them some signs and finger spelling. We worked all over, and I stayed there for 18 years, until I got sick. I had to go to hospital in Belfast, and the doctor told me I shouldn't be working on the roads. Was that because of fume inhalation? Yes, and because of health and safety. There was a risk to my life. He said the fact that I couldn't hear oncoming traffic was too dangerous, which resonated with me because I'd had a few close shaves in my time. There I was, busy working and oblivious to the engine noises coming towards me. A few hairy moments, I tell you. I came close a number of times. When I left school, I went to college in Omagh. There was an ISL interpreter organised and everything was set, and then at the last minute I got let down. The college rates for interpreters weren't as good as other freelance work, and I ended up very disappointed. I knew the interpreter too, and they signed well, but I had to persevere without one. It was assumed I wouldn't cope because I was deaf, but I was able to because of my experience at school and the hard time having to write things down from the board. I actually found it easier than school, and I passed. In fact, myself and another student came top, which challenged the earlier assumption, and it was evidence that being deaf does not mean you cannot achieve. I progressed to university in Belfast, and luckily they provided an interpreter. But sod's law, it was a BSL interpreter. I had wanted ISL, but for whatever reason it didn't happen. It was quite an adjustment for me, and to be honest, I found it a bit of a struggle initially, but I did adapt, and I did well. I passed all my assignments, and I passed the course. Then I got a job working as an electronic test technician for 7 years. That entailed checking electronic circuit boards. They had a metal detection system using headphones there, but I didn't use that obviously. I checked everything was working correctly in a baby food factory, so if anything fell into the food it would be detected and removed. For example, metal. It was important the food was immaculate and had nothing in it that could lead to being ingested. I worked with the computer to ensure the production line passed, and if it didn't, it had to be rectified. I did that, as I say, for 7 years. I was 16 when I left school. I remember before I left, one Christian brother asked me if I wanted to remain at school for 2 more years. But I happily declined. I then got a job working as a tailor. I didn't relish the thought. But when I got there was another deaf man working there. He was quite old. He could use sign language. And from talking to him, it transpired he went to the same deaf school as me, in Carrbridge, Dublin. We discussed how awful the wages were. My wages were £2 a week and he got £5 a week because he was married with a family. I was confused and I told my father about the poor wages. But he encouraged me to continue. He said, "Hold on, just wait and see." He said I had to stay and not to go on the dole, but I didn't understand what the dole meant. And he tried to explain to me, you need to work, you need wages. Anyway, I wanted another job, and I told the owner, the boss, and he offered me a raise up to £3 a week. And I told him no, there's another job and they're offering £10. But he wouldn't budge. So I told him I was leaving. He wasn't pleased. Anyway, I went to the other job. It was in construction and I worked as a labourer. It was handy enough. I was only 18 or 19 at that time. I continued working on there and then we got married. I had left school, I would say about 6 months, when a Belfast man visited my house. He said he could help me find a job, and he did. I worked in retail for 17 years, right up until I got married. Yes, for 17 years. It was the only job I had. I had quite a few jobs. So, I wanted something different. And I got a job working as a driver. But it was only for 1 year, because alas, the company closed down. The wages were great too. All three of us working there lost our jobs. I was very dismayed, but what could I do? Do you have any qualifications? No, I have qualifications. I left school for training. What age did you leave school? 17. I left at 20. I have my qualifications. I did the junior cert and then my leaving cert. And I passed them all. Oh, good. Before I did RSA. What's RSA? Royal something. It was an awarding body. What subjects? Maths and typing. Did you go into employment? Well, my father was ill, but before that I did work for 2 years in a factory in Limavady. Oh, the factory? Yes, we made ladies' lingerie. I was a machinist. There was 5 deaf working there and we used a mixture of ISL and BSL. That was good then, having deaf colleagues. What about you? Did you work? No, I never worked. I've been unemployed all of my life. Then I got married and had my children. My first job was working in a factory. It was a shirt factory and I made the cuffs. It came about because my father came with me to the interview and did the talking for me. I just sat quiet and then was told I could start on Monday. I was very nervous starting. I was shaking like a wreck. It was an all-hearing environment and it was huge and I was the only deaf person there. But I just kept my head down and worked. Did you enjoy working there? I had no choice. I would have preferred typing work, but I ended up in the factory. I left school and went to college and got railroaded into a computer course, which I hated, but I did it for 1 year. Once that was finished, my mother told me not to be expecting to lie around and doing nothing. So I knew there was a few deaf women working in a factory, I think about 4 or 5. So like you, I went along to the interview with my father. And he did the talking for me. And then I was told I could start. I remember always looking forward to lunchtime to have a good chat. I worked there for 1 year, which really gave me time to think. And I decided to move to Belfast and enrol in a course doing beauty and hairdressing. And The rest is history. I remember after school, my mother was very anxious for me to get a job. I was only 16 and she was rushing me to find work. I got my first job working in a factory. They were all hearing. Some of them knew me. What about you? My education was very poor. I was behind. For example, when I was 13, my reading age was 8. All the emphasis was in speech and language therapy. It was very hard work. It was the same at home. My family encouraged me to lip read. They did not want me using sign language. When I left school, I had no qualifications and just took work as an assistant cook. I did a few different jobs before I decided to try to teach sign language. I taught in the college for 25 years, and during that time I realised I needed to get qualified, as I couldn't because of my English deficit in the past. Then an opportunity came up and I went to university, and that was 2014 to 2016, and I achieved a PGCE. I learned a lot. It was a new challenge for me with different modules, but I loved teaching. I was first introduced to the deaf world by Bobby Devine. He told me all about the local deaf community. I remember that so well. No, no. He asked me if I received contact, and I told him that I hadn't. So he helped me and arranged for it to be posted to my house. Contact was a magazine with deaf news. It contained chat articles, deaf parent stories, sign language classes for children, etc. So I had a job and a car, and life was going along when someone told me about the deaf clubs, that there was one in Omagh and one in Derry. So I went along to the Omagh Deaf Club. It was big. There was a good crowd there. What age were you? I was about 19 or 20. It's a long time ago now, as I'm nearly 60. The organiser was the mother of a deaf man, James Corey. Oh, Florence, yes. I remember being told it was a big club, and it was. This was the first time I was exposed to ISL, which confused me, as I wrongly thought there was only one sign language used here. The ISL deaf people had went to school in Dublin, but I wasn't aware of that. It took a while initially reading the ISL signs, but it wasn't long before I had acquired it from chatting at the deaf club every Friday night. Soon I was as fluent in ISL as I was in my first language, BSL. So I had a lot of cleaning to do. Tidying the bedrooms, making the beds. Weekdays and weekends were the same, and I never got to go home. Good question. I remember going to the Monday Club with my father at KC Church, and they were all signing BSL there, which was strange. They were curious about me and where I was from. I told them I'd been to school at Dublin. Some of them got quite derogatory about Dublin to me, but it wasn't my fault. I'd been sent to school there by my parents. I felt quite insulted by this. Then in time, I picked up bits and pieces of BSL. Some deaf there helped me. At home we used our own system of communication. Every month there was a mass, a Catholic mass, organised by the nuns. And I remember going there and there was a coach of ISL deaf people. They had went to the same school as me, St Mary's. It was great. There were so many of them, and I was chatting away to them in my ISL language. It was so different to the local deaf club where I was struggling with the language. Now clubs are dwindling away and the monthly mass is no more. I remember when I first went to the deaf club. It was all new to me. I was in awe of everything. I was young and shy. In the deaf club, yes, it was Northwest Deaf Association, NWDA. I remember what the building looked like. I remember the room we used. I met all the deaf members. I felt so happy. There was such a good crowd. I learned so much. It was lovely. We owe a huge debt of thanks to Noel McCluskey. He was the founder of the club. It was to bring deaf people together. Then we moved to Glenbrook. Did he move to Portadown? Yeah, but I'm talking about the club. It was St Patrick's first. The first dinner dance was in Donegal. Oh, I remember that. It was fabulous. Yes, we had 150 deaf people. There were others invited too, including the bishops. Both the Protestant and the Catholic bishops attended, and the deaf group was cross-community. It was as if deaf people could change the political world and have peace. Such nostalgia. I remember that. As I said, the communication barrier was fierce. But I was fortunate to have my deaf friends, Noel and Harry. And I remember we used to go out at the weekends. There was no deaf club at that time, so we used to set off at the weekends in the car. I really enjoyed it. It was great. I worked all week and looked forward to the weekends with them. Friday, Saturday, and then Sunday rest up for going back to work. After some time, the deaf club was set up and things really improved. When was that? 1979. I'd left school in 1974. And up until then, we just had our weekends out and about. Interesting, were you the same? Yes, I was working in Dungannon. I worked there for 20 odd years. And I enjoyed every minute of it. How did you get involved at the deaf club? I was told by a deaf person there was a club in Derry. So I went along by myself. It was on Friday nights. I met many people there. It was good. How I got involved. So I went to work and came home. I knew some deaf people from my school were living around my area, but I was a home bird. Then a deaf person visited my house and told me about the deaf club. I hadn't known anything about it, so they invited me to go along with them. It was St Joseph's Deaf Club on the Falls Road, Bread Street. So we went there, and some of the adults recognised me from when I was a young boy. They welcomed me with open arms, and once the introductions were over, we played some games. I remember playing drafts. It was great, playing and chatting. The club was every Friday night. The committee organised some competitions with the games. There were drafts, table tennis, cards, etc. I used to study the older ones playing the cards, and I learned the game, and then I decided I would chance it. I was quite nervous as there was money at stake, but I was lucky, and I won, and I was able to get myself some new clothes. And when I was asked at home about this, of course I made up some excuses. Clever. Every Friday night at the Deaf Club, we'd be socialising away up until about 10 o'clock, and then we would head over to the pub. And we'd stay there chatting until about 1 or 2 in the morning. They were wonderful times. Some had cars, which was great for whenever it was cold. Then I lived in Castledurg, which was quite far away. It was about 50 miles. But I wouldn't miss a Friday night because it was my relief from isolation. It was a wonderful time. I really enjoyed it. I remember meeting James Burke, which was very different from me, as he signed using BSL. We used to enjoy going out at the weekends. We would go for a drink and play pool. I loved pool. I really enjoyed myself. At St. Joseph's, someone told me about another club. They said it was good. They played pool, darts, table tennis, football, the whole gambit. I was amazed. At St. Joseph's, it was an indoor club, but the other place was outdoor as well. Anyway, I went and thought they would be using ISL, but they were signing in BSL. I was lost. I know ISL has a female dialect, but I didn't know what they were saying. Learning a new language was challenging firstly. I learned the alphabet, and after some time I picked it up well. It's great being able to communicate in both languages. However, ISL is my native language. It's the same for me. I'm ISL first and foremost. But I remember meeting a new boy who used BSL. It was quite testing trying to pick BSL up, but eventually I did, and it's rich to know both. In terms of age, you started after you left school at 19, but I first went to the Deaf Club when I was about 12 or 13. I was very fortunate as the older deaf people were a mine of information, passing on stories and educating me on the ways of the world. Both languages were used there. At Omaclump, sometimes there were talks to a mix of ISL and BSL deaf people, and I recall a Protestant interpreter being there, with a deaf relay interpreter. The philosophy of the time was BSL was for Protestants and ISL was for Catholics. That was the first time I saw a deaf relay interpretation. Now I am a relay interpreter, having gained level 6 in BSL and ISL. Looking back, we were very lucky to live in a bilingual community, as we were immersed in a unique culture. It has to be said sometimes processing between two languages can be exhausting. How did you first meet deaf people when you left school? So, I knew a deaf person quite well, and we arranged to go swimming in Limavady. It was great. We went swimming and had a chat. It was a lovely time. Was there a deaf club? Yes, NWDA. At that club for the first time was very daunting for me. I didn't know anyone there, and there was a mixture of both languages being used. When I was small at NWDA, I couldn't understand what they were saying, as I didn't know sign language. I just looked around mystified at what I was saying. I couldn't understand anything. I remember both of you when you were young at Bishop Street. Yes, Bishop Street. Oh, I was completely lost then. But when I left school, going to the deaf club helped me to retain my sign language. In Oma we had a deaf club. I grew up going there from the age of 4 or 5. It was every Friday. Back then there were some special times, for example at Christmas and Halloween. Lovely. There were dinner dances attended by all the deaf community in Northern Ireland. Delightful memories. After I finished my training course, my mother got in touch with the social worker, and they came out and told us there was a deaf club in Derry. I inquired when it was held and they told me it was on a Friday night. So, my father offered to give me a lift because at that time I couldn't drive. I was about 18 or 19. So we went to NWDA. It was in a hut in the grounds of the chapel. They were all older than me, which was very overwhelming. My father waited for me in the pub, and then when it was time to go home, he collected me. He took me every Friday. They knew it was important for me to have deaf people. Then in time I learned to drive. What age did you pass your test? I was 19. I picked it up quickly. I was able to offer some deaf people who lived near me a lift, which was good for me to have company late at night, especially with the troubles and the army checkpoints. Being asked for your licence and such and trying to communicate in the dark was quite scary. I was lucky I wasn't exposed to that. I was young and at home with my family, thankfully. The deaf club became my second home, with the deaf members being my other family. Like you, we had big events on, where all the deaf came together for dinner dances, etc., and we all mixed together. Gorgeous memories. I remember me and my husband had just got married, and we went to the old deaf club in Derry. Oh, the style of the time we had. It was fantastic, chatting in sign language and meeting deaf people. It was so interesting. I thought lip reading was good, but the sign language was so relaxing and interesting. What about you? I remember meeting everyone at the deaf club. Some were older. The age range varied. I learned so much. It was so interesting. After the deaf club on a Friday night, we used to go to the pub and continued chatting into the wee hours. We had such a bond. The atmosphere was amazing. Things have changed a lot now though. I found out about a deaf club in Belfast on the Falls Road. I told my daddy and he questioned me about where it was. And I told him it was in Bread Street. So he gave me directions. Anyway, I decided to go and I caught the bus. On the bus, I showed the inspector the note I had with the address on it. The bus in time stopped and he ushered me forward and pointed out Bread Street. I walked over and I remember thinking to myself, this is a housing area. I looked all around, trying to see something that looked remotely like a deaf club. At first, I went to the wrong door, and they told me next door. Two deaf men appeared in the doorway. They were older than me. We went in, and gosh, they were all past pupils from my school, Cabra. The excitement that night was electric. Catching up, it was miraculous. They asked if I could play football, which I could. Oh, the memories of that experience are still magical to this day. Every Sunday at the Deaf Club. When I left school, I was estranged from my deaf peers. I was in the hearing world. In my heart, I had my deaf identity, and I went to deaf events like dinner dances. The Troubles were ongoing at that time in Northern Ireland. I hardly ever went to the Deaf Club, but I liked dinner dances and mixed with the others there. There were two deaf who lived near my home, and I would visit them the odd time for a cup of tea and a chat. There were dinner dances for deaf people in places like Dublin and other areas where deaf people could socialise to relieve their isolation. It was so important to have this support network. It was a lifeline. Some deaf people were deprived of this because their parents didn't let them go. The Deaf Club was our sanctuary. It was so interesting. And then I fell in love and got married. My wife was from Newry. We met in Belfast at a Christmas party. I fancied her straight away and wasn't long in asking for her address. Soon enough after that, I was catching the bus to Newry. I got off the bus and asked for directions to her house. I took off up the hill. I was on cloud 9. I stopped with a man smoking a pipe and asked him where the house was. And he led me to the house. It was her father. Her mammy thought I was a lovely boy. We were in the kitchen and they heard a cup smashing. She had dropped it with nervousness. Her mum thought it was me that had broken it. After school, where I lived, there was no deaf club. So I used to visit 3 of my deaf friends for catch-ups. One was called McKernan. We shared stories and visited each other all the time. Then I got married, and obviously that all came to an end. There was an old deaf man, and he helped me find the nearest deaf club. So myself and my sister went along with him. It was in Belfast. I went in and took it all in. There was a range of deaf people there, and that was the start of it. I used to go regularly every Sunday. We've been together ever since. In fact, how long? 53 years. He's a great man. I've always liked him. Thank you. The comparison between now and the past is thankfully that people generally have a better attitude towards deaf people, as opposed to before, when we were largely disregarded. We had to try hard to make the effort to be understood, but nowadays, mostly people are open to using gestures. We can write a message on our mobile phone and show it, or still use pen and paper. Either way, I don't mind. Long before mobile phones, being deaf, you had to drive to someone's house to communicate with them. You had no instant messaging then to make arrangements. Technology is improving all the time, which is so helpful and has transformed communication for us compared to the arduous past. Similarly, after my school days, I met up with deaf friends at weekends and so on. But say, if I needed to see someone and they lived 10 minutes away, I would cycle to their house, knock on their door and ask their parents for them. Then we would have a good catch up and a cup of tea. However, on the flip side, I could have made the trip all the way and they weren't in, so I'd have to cycle all the way back home. It was awful then compared to now. Just sending a text is so easy. That's true, it was hassle. Do you remember using Type Talk, the relay telephone service? Do you remember? Now it's mobile phones and communication is instant. Years ago in deaf homes, there were no flashing alerts to let us know the doorbell was ringing, or the baby was crying, or that someone was collecting at the door. You had to keep vigilant, as we didn't have the facilities we have now, which thankfully make life better. Back then I had no car, so I had to walk or cycle, mostly walk everywhere or use the bike if necessary. Sometimes at the deaf club there wasn't much happening and I wanted something else. You weren't allowed to go to the dances then, so I would walk all the way home just to pass the time. Yes, that was during the Troubles. That's right, and communication at home with my mother without sign language was dull, whereas with deaf people you could chat away to lift your spirits. Healthy. Of course I loved my mother. Technology now compared to the past, what's your opinion? We used to use a Minicom telephone, but I think the doorbell is better. Pagers are limited as they use up batteries quicker. I think the computer's the best. I love my mobile phone. Yes, mobile phones are great and you can text to keep in touch, which is so handy. Yes, mobile phones are. You can text or make video calls now. It's great. Yes, they lift your mind. I remember the old Minicom. You know the machine you used with the telephone and it took ages typing your message. Then there was Type Talk. And yes, that's right, the fax machine. I remember sending and receiving paper messages using the fax. That was before video calls. In today's world, I prefer video calls to have that visual conversation than writing. Sign language is more natural and you are assured the message has been correct. Email is useful, but again, it's English orientated, which isn't my preference. In the past, equipment had limitations with only a few choices, but technology today is so innovative. Access has erupted. For example, having access to interpreters. We used to have so few interpreters and it was difficult to get one booked. But things have got much better in that respect. Technology, past and present. Back in the day, there were no mobile phones. There was equipment like the Minicom, which I didn't use much. My friends lived too far away, and I stayed in the hearing world. I had only about 3 contacts I phoned using the Minicom. I'm learning from my children now how they use technology, and I've moved with the times. Now I use a mobile phone which is so popular and has everything I need in one device. If I want to find anything out, I don't have to bother anyone. I can find out myself. Sometimes if the English is hard, maybe I'll contact a deaf person, but I have the choice. Yes, that is true. In the past, when going to the doctor, there were no interpreters, and you had to depend on writing things down. When the doctor wrote the message, it was difficult to read. You know the famous doctor's handwriting. Often I had to ask at reception what the doctor had written. Communication was so difficult. Maybe other people were okay, but the doctor's writing was taxing. Interpreters nowadays make it easier. You can communicate using sign language, whereas it wasn't easy to get your message across before. I recall my mother taking me to the doctor's. We'd arrive and she would do all the talking at reception. Then in the waiting area, I would just sit there in wonderment at what might be going on. Then we'd be called in, and the doctor would examine me and ask questions like if I had a sore tummy. They would try to use gestures, but overall the communication was never successful, and my mother would do the talking at what she thought might be wrong with me. I remember going to the doctor on my own, and as usual, sitting there watching like a hawk to see if it was my turn yet. I would always remind reception to get my attention if I was called. If it was their break time, there would be a different receptionist come on, and they wouldn't be aware. Then I'd notice people looking at me funny, and I'd realise they were calling me but I didn't know. How embarrassing. Now having interpreters and modern technology, things are much better. One time I went to hospital, for whatever the reason was, and there was a man sitting there reading the newspaper. I pointed to my ear to indicate I was deaf, and he just pointed over there. I hadn't said where I needed to be, but I went along, and it was ENT. So I went back and told him again, I'm deaf, and asked where the clinic was. Oh, sorry, he said. He reacted properly this time and gave me directions. A typical communication misunderstanding. Now I know my way around there, but the building was all new to me then. What about you? Yes, there are always problems with communication. I will put my queries forward to try and get them sorted out, usually by writing things down. Even at the hospital. Yes, it isn't easy at all. You know when you go for a check-up, often they ask you if you can lip read. I always say not really, just a little. But still, they try to speak to me. But it's futile. Then they usually use gestures like injection. I remember getting an injection one time and the needle hit the bone. And I reacted by grabbing her by the arm. She told me to calm down, it would be all right. But being deaf, she wasn't able to explain to me what to expect. Back in the day before fax machines, we used to write letters to each other to communicate. I remember that. Oh, and I also remember the deaf clubs in Derry and in Omagh. When I had my first baby, Brendan, there was no equipment to alert us if the baby was crying. We had to keep constant watch to make sure he was all right. At night, me and my husband took it in turns to get up and check on him and attend to him. It was hard. I remember the stress of not knowing if the baby was breathing and checking to see if their chest was moving or placing my hand to feel it. It was hard work 24/7 back then. One time, my daughter was crying. It was in the early hours, I can't remember the time. But my son, who was only 4, came in to tell me that the baby was crying. What had happened was the battery on the baby alarm needed charged, so it hadn't received the sound from the microphone on the cot. I picked her up feeling terrible that I hadn't realised. Technology is great now, although my children are grown up. Nowadays the alarms are quite sophisticated. They change colour to show if the baby's breathing or crying. Technology is advancing at a quick pace, a stark contrast from our time. Yes, you're right. Back then, without interpreters, we were in the dark about what was being said. Now, we have face-to-face and remote interpreters. Interpreters are an integral part of our lives. It's great having them. For example, sign video, which works very well. Communication is central to everything in our lives. Technology is great now. I remember the old minicom. You used to have to make your arrangements to meet up, all before we had mobile phones and text messages. So you would agree your plans with your friends, and then if you tried to call them, sometimes you'd be waiting for them to respond. I remember taking the handset off the couplers and asking someone to listen if the phone was ringing or if it had been answered. Then there was a certain keyboard etiquette we used, like GA meant go ahead for the other person to type, or SKSK meant stop keying to end the call. Now we can make video calls on our mobile phone. You can carry your phone around and contact who you like, when you like. I also remember using the fax machine. You'd write your message and send it off and wait patiently for their reply. These things were only useful if both people were in the location of the machine. If you were away from it, you couldn't use it, which created delays. Then there was a flip device that you could use. And it was the same with emails, when you could only use them from a PC, whereas now everything you need is in your phone. Life is so handy. With the demise in the deaf clubs, we can still communicate using our phones. When I was about 16 or 17, if you wanted to make a phone call, you had to ask someone to do it for you, or make your arrangements in advance, like where to meet and when. Then the social worker gave me a minicom. At first I hadn't a clue how to use it, so they had to teach me. I had to persevere until I got the hang of it. and then deaf people could phone each other. Did it help to improve your English? Oh yes, that's right. That's right. Then I got a fax machine, which was better than the Minicom. Sometimes you would send off your message, but the other person was away. So you were left wondering why they hadn't replied, or vice versa, because one or both of us may be out. So whatever the fax machine was better, it wasn't instant correspondence like it is now. I remember getting my first text message, and then rapidly text messaging took off like a wildfire spreading, despite it being in English. Then, when being able to make video calls on your phone was available, it was the ultimate. Excellent being able to sign with your friends. I remember as a young teenager being so isolated, it was horrendous. Life is very busy now. There's always plenty to do on your phone. One thing is you have to make sure you keep your battery charged though. You also have interpreter access on your phone. Previously at the doctor's you had to write things down to communicate. But now you can just tap the app on your device and you have instant access to an interpreter on your phone. It's great to get the details, as before you wouldn't be sure what the words meant. The interpreter can speak in your behalf and sign back to you what the doctor is saying, which is very efficient. It ensures effective communication and removes stress and speeds up the whole process. A deaf man was telling me about his experience in hospital. The doctor came round and the deaf man had wrote on a page he wanted to have signed video. So they organised it for him and he was able to communicate with the staff. It's great having these things. We had our struggles, but now communication is handier. The need to congregate isn't as important anymore, as we can use our phones to make video calls, whereas in the past the deaf club was vital. After the deaf club we'd head to the pub and carry on chatting, or stand under a street light so we could see each other. And then eventually we would start to make our way home. What time did the club finish? About 10 or half 10. Technology is great now compared to the past. Back then, the deaf club was a must, but now we can communicate remotely, which I have mixed views about. Half of me thinks it's good and the other half not. What about you? Yes, I agree with you. I think the past was better. We got out of the house, met up face to face, we had that social activity to look forward to. But now text messages are short conversations. We're at home looking at a small screen. I mean, yes, technology is great and it's brilliant access to the remote interpreter service. Looking back 3 years ago during lockdown, it was woeful. But we have to be thankful for technology because without it we could never have survived. I agree having the new interpreter service is fantastic, especially for medical appointments, but mostly they're for medical emergencies. I really prefer face-to-face, do you? Me too. I like face-to-face better. Life now without technology would be impossible. We need our phone for quick contact, especially in an emergency. Yes, phones have everything you need. Email, the whole 9 yards. But at home on Zoom, the screen keeps freezing, which is so annoying. So technology isn't always perfect. When I lived at home, I used to ask my mum to make calls for me, like to my friend's house who lived far away. This was before we had a Minicom. So mum would ring their parents and they would be chatting for ages. And I was like a cat in a hot tin roof, waiting patiently to know the information. Then finally, I would know the details and head to Belfast to visit, but now I can just text myself. I had a Minicom my mother bought for me. She thought it would help to improve my English. I used to make long calls, maybe for 1 or 2 hours, typing messages back and forth. The bill came in, but luckily we were eligible for discount 20%. Even the bill was expensive. My mother wanted me to carry on using it to keep my English going. It gave me that independence to make phone calls. Now, if my kids wanted to chat that long, I would be objecting profusely. I remember the fax machine, sending and receiving messages. Yes, and remember the old pagers, they gave you the short message, but with the fax you could write a long message. However, you had no privacy, as anyone could read it when you weren't there. Yes, that's right, you had to grin and bear it. Technology encompasses so many different things, from computers and so on. The massive challenge is keeping abreast of it all. Some things I've got the hang of, but when confronted with another new device or system, I'm lost. I like to keep life simple, but technology is leading the way in the modern world. We have iPads, mobiles, email, the list goes on. It does bring us access, and that is important, especially to the remote interpreter service and having an interpreter present for appointments like at the doctor's or the hospital or a dentist. It's so necessary. Things in that way are much better than before. How do you feel? Well, I have very limited English and I have learned to use computers, etc. So I'm really happy about that. The mobile phone is so helpful for the things I need. I can make video calls in sign language and I feel great about that. In the past, you had to meet up in person to have a conversation in sign language. Now you can stay put and use your phone. What a big shift. I remember the awful times. I stayed in the house because of the ongoing troubles. My mother didn't want me out as it was very dangerous. It was here in Strabane at that time. Eamon McDevitt was always up to mischief. He used to hang around with David Barr. In fact, David taught him sign language, if I remember rightly. What had happened was, one day he was out on the street and he picked something up from the ground and he was waving it around and he got shot in the neck. The Troubles conflict was between religions, Catholics and Protestants. The only effect it had on me was, for example, if I was out for a drink with hearing friends and the door opened, everyone immediately looked around in fear to see who was there in case it might be a gunman. Vigilance was heightened then, but life carried on. Deaf people were not really involved with the Troubles. Mostly people stayed in their own family bubble to keep themselves safe. Back then there wasn't large gatherings within the deaf community for that reason. My primary school was on the Falls Road, Belfast, which was a flashpoint for trouble. I think it was about 1980-81 during the hunger strike. I remember going to school on the bus, and I'll never forget the bus weaving through fires and barricades and riots, and I remember seeing a man standing with a balaclava on, and I innocently was merrily waving to him. He was armed. The bus staff told me to stop, but I hadn't a clue what the whole thing meant. I was so excited seeing this action man, I didn't know it was the IRA. One time in school, while watching TV, the TV was on a movable stand. And all of a sudden it started to shudder. A bomb had exploded and I hadn't understood why the TV started to shudder. Then the teacher told us we could go home. I was so excited to be getting out of school early. From memory, it was a huge bomb, 5,000 pounds of explosives, and it was outside Andersonstown police station. That TV shuddering is something I'll never forget. Do you remember the time of the Troubles here? Yes, it was awful. Words couldn't describe it. What was it like? Terrible. I remember going back on Sunday and then being sent home because of the unrest over the hunger strikes. I can't remember exactly when, but I was wondering what was going on. I could obviously see people marching, but couldn't make any sense of it then. I found out later they were protesting over Bloody Sunday and the hunger strikes. And over time I came to learn more about it all. It was shocking, really. I remember the fateful day in 1972. It was Bloody Sunday. I was out walking. It was a lovely day, but bitter cold. I was along with my friends Harry and Noel, and we could see all the people marching peacefully along the route they had planned. When we reached the bog side, Noel left us. Up ahead there was a barricade where the soldiers and the police were waiting. At that time they used rubber bullets and water cannons to disperse crowds, and in the water there was dye they used to mark the skin, and that helped them catch anyone involved with protests or riots. Shots were fired and we were obviously very unnerved. We retreated into the bottom of the flats behind pillars. Then I saw a man hit the ground. He started to roll and lay there face down for about 5 minutes. People soon came around him. He had been shot in the back. I saw another shooting that day. Another man got shot from behind. It was hard to believe this was really happening. Oh my God, we were so lucky to get out unscathed when you think of the horror of what happened. Young men getting gunned down. It was sickening. I was in total shock. That's terrible. Even after a year and beyond, I suffered flashbacks from what I witnessed that day. Thankfully, over time it has lessened. I remember back in Belfast, my mother always used to tell me to be careful. I always played it down and acted cool, even though I had anxiety about the Troubles at that time. One night I was at the Deaf Club. It was around about 11, and I left and was walking home. The club was about 15 minutes away from where I lived. There seemed to be commotion going on around, but we were signing away and decided to stop for fish and chips. It wasn't the best time of the night to be eating, but anyway, we continued on, and then my friend went his way, and I continued to the Grosvenor Road. It was near the Royal Victoria Hospital, and there were armed officers, and they tried to communicate with me. I tried to say I was deaf. They seemed suspicious. So I took out a pen and paper and wrote to them I was deaf and returning from the Deaf Club. They wanted to know where it was, and I pointed. Then they told me to carry on, and all I could think about was my mother was right to advise me about the danger. It was scary. Another time I was going to work in Lisburn by bus. I worked with yarn there, and after my shift I caught the bus back to Belfast. It was late, about 11 p.m. I was on the 3 to 11 shift. I was walking along with a shoulder bag that had a change of clothes in it, when I noticed soldiers lined up on the road. I walked past them, watching them out the side of my eye. I didn't expect anything to happen, when suddenly I was pushed against the wall. I eventually got through to them that I was deaf, and I could see one soldier waving his arms, making the cancel gesture to another soldier, that was on his knees with the rifle pointed at me. He continued gesturing and signalled I was deaf. He wrote that he was sorry, and I obviously remained polite, but I was petrified. Then he wanted to know what was in the bag, and I said it was my work clothing, but there had been a knot that was sticking through the bag that looked like a gun. He questioned me and I explained my work, etc., so he let me go. When I got home, my mother was worried, and she told me, "You need to tell the boss it's not safe walking at night, that a taxi would be safer." Another night, roughly the same time, I was walking home and there was a line of soldiers, and I was passing when they grabbed me. There seemed to be something going on the roof. They shone a bright light on my face and wanted to know the reason I was out late with a bag. It was the same story over again. Me explaining that I was deaf, I was coming from work, and luckily they let me go. My mother wasn't happy and stressed I needed to report this to the boss. At work I broached it with him and he was sympathetic. There was another deaf man there, he was from the other side of town, the Shankill. He used BSL and I used ISL. He was friends with Bobby Bailey. We were to share a taxi, and there was a bit of contention about us living on opposite sides of the political spectrum, the Shankill and the Grosvenor, but I knew a short way, and the plan was for me to get dropped off first. We'd been doing this for a while when one night there was two men sitting and my friend said to me, "Watch out." Really, it was a plan to trick me, but I didn't know. He said, "They're probably armed with knives." Like, what could you do with a knife? Exactly. I remember the security forces always picking on me because I had red hair. Me and my wife were in the car one day when there was a roadblock. They told me to get out, and my wife lost her temper. I tried to calm her down, but it was too late. We were both ordered out of the car and searched. Oh, and that reminds me, I must tell you about another time. There was me, Noel and Harry. And Noel had been learning to drive and had just passed the test, with Harry sitting in with him. We landed in Bundoran a run, and on the way back, didn't the car break down? We had no option but to leave it where it was, because we didn't know what was wrong with it. We agreed to catch the bus, and when we were on the bus, this young man got on. He looked wild, to be honest with you. We never took him on, and then the bus stopped at the border, and a soldier got on board, looked around, and got off. A bit further we were stopped again, and another soldier got on, and he signalled to me to come forward. I couldn't understand why he wanted me, so I went forward, got off the bus, and the bus drove off. Everything was running through my mind. As he was looking through some photographs in a book, he kept looking at them and at me. And what had happened was, it turned out I looked very similar to a person of interest. Once he was sure it wasn't me, he said I could go, but I had no way home. So I said I would have to thumb a lift. Next, this fancy Jaguar pulled up, and I got in, and got back in style. But there were many occasions they got me mixed up with their list of terrorists. Yes, that happened. The famous red hair. Did anything like that ever happen you? No, it never did happen me. I'm a quiet person by nature. I had just turned 18 and passed my driving test. Now, the police thrived on harassment. There were always those checkpoints, when they asked to see your licence and inquire where you were going, etc. So I had just left one checkpoint and went around the corner, and there was another one. I was so fed up. And then soldiers appeared, and one pointed the gun onto my car. I tried to say I was deaf. They wanted to know where I was going, and I said I was going to visit a friend, but wouldn't say any more. Tension soon arose between us, and the soldier, while pointing the gun at me, threatened me. At that time I supported the Republican movement, and I was waiting to meet a friend when the army appeared and formed a line. I had no idea what they were doing, so I moved away, when one signalled to me he had eyes on me and could shoot me in the head. I moved further away from where I was supposed to meet my friend, and when he eventually found me, I had to explain to him what had happened. It was awful times with all the security forces everywhere. Then in 1968 the trouble started. Do you remember? Yes, I remember walking to work back then. It was very scary, especially with the body searches. I was always relieved to get them over and done with. Yes, I remember those times. There are two occasions that stick out for me. The first was when I was about 6 months pregnant. Myself and my mum were buying sugar, when suddenly the floor moved beneath us. A bomb had exploded without warning. The warning had been given, but the police didn't act on it. The other one was when my husband was in Long Kesh prison. Whenever you went to visit, the search regime was extreme. They even opened babies' nappies to check inside them. To be honest, they communicated with me okay. It was exhausting travelling all the way to visit for 15 years. Did you have to go by bus every day? Yes, I remember going twice a week. Luckily we had PDF, which was Prisoner Dependence Fund, for expenses like your food and bus fares. I had heard about trouble in Derry. My mother and father didn't allow me to go there, as I was deaf, and the fact that I had never been and did not know the area. So they worried about that, and they kept me away from it. We had a big family, and I was the only deaf member of the family. Yes, I had a good family, and being honest, I was spoiled. I have lovely memories of growing up. When I came home from school during the holidays, I remember my sisters telling me about the bombs and everything. But I hadn't a clue about the troubles because I was at boarding school in Dublin all the time. They were talking about the hype in Derry and Belfast and the shootings, etc. But I really didn't have a clue what they were talking about. It was all very scary. When I left school, the army were installed everywhere. It made no sense to me, and to this day, I only know some of what happened during the Troubles. I remember hearing people mocking me because I was deaf. There was always trouble on the Falls Road. But where I lived was very peaceful. Nothing was going to stop me walking along the falls though. I had no reservation about that, but I can recall the army stopping me. I signed in an over-the-top, exaggerated way, "I am deaf." One was checking back with another about me, and he affirmed that I was deaf and I could go. The reason they knew this was because the army used the deaf club sometimes. I was shocked when I realised this, but the club did let them use the building to raise a bit of money. and that's how they recognised me. What can I say? I was never involved with the troubles. I remained neutral and kept myself to myself. I remained within my family and friends, and we never experienced any problems. Oh, the troubles were harrowing times, and people suffered. We deaf people didn't get access to what was going on back then, especially as there weren't any interpreters. We didn't understand what it was all about at all. We were starved of the information. Profoundly deaf. My father was also born profoundly deaf, but my mother wasn't. She became deaf at the age of 5 as a result of meningitis. My father comes from Castlewellan in County Down, and my mother comes from Armagh. This story is about my father and goes back to when he was 8 years of age. My father had been sent to St Joseph's School for Deaf Boys in Dublin. He was the firstborn in the family and had a sister, Mary, who was hearing. At the time, his mother was expecting her third child, and sadly, she died in labour with this baby. She was only 32, and a few hours after giving birth to the baby son, he died as well. My grandfather was bereft and did not know what to do, and decided to place my father in this school at St Joseph's. He never got home. Even at holidays, Christmas time, etc., he had to remain. All the other boys went home to their families during the holidays, but he never did. Another person told me that he used to run away all the time, but my father never told me this. Perhaps he was embarrassed. I can understand why he ran away, because the Christian brothers drove a hard bargain in terms of chores and labour, coupled with the fact that he never got home. Poor Dad never had a relationship with his father. He continued at school, and when he was 16, a Christian brother told him he would be starting a new job, flying airplanes. Oh, he was so excited. He could hardly contain himself. The job was in Limerick, and he couldn't wait. They caught the train, and when they arrived at the station, there was a man and a woman waiting for them. They struck up a conversation, and Daddy was looking all around, taking in all the sights, as he had no way to know what they were talking about. When they finished, the Christian brother wished my father luck and bid him farewell, and set about returning back to Dublin. My father was relieved to be leaving school behind and beginning a new chapter in his life. He got in the car with these strange people, and they drove for a long time over an expanse of farmland, hill and dale, with lots of cows, horses, sheep, etc. After a long journey, they finally arrived at this place. My father was quite bewildered, and the man beckoned him into a building. It was a cow shed. He told him it was his job to milk the cows. My father was in disbelief, as he'd been led to believe he would be working with airplanes. The stark truth was he had been deceived, and what he had to do in reality was sit and milk cows all the time. Bearing in mind, it was all done manually, as there was no such equipment to milk the cows back then. The man spared no mercy, and he was forced to work constantly, despite his hands and wrists aching. Sometimes my father would only milk the cow half, as he could see their distress and knew they needed out. But when the farmer caught him not working as he wanted, he beat him up. Dad was defenceless and had to throw the treatment dished out by the farmer. This continued right up until my father was 25 years old. 9 long years for a pittance of wages, 25 pence. Dad was still wearing the clothes he arrived in from school, and all he had was the bag he brought with him. He had an extremely long beard, and he was in threadbare rags, but he endured. He never got anything for himself like a break or be able to attend church. Even if he was sick, there was no care or slack cut. It was a constant regime every single day. During this extreme sufferance, he secretly prepared himself to escape. In all this time, he had been taught no skills. One day he went to the house and knocked the door. When the woman opened it, he asked if he could borrow some money, and she said no, and slammed the door shut. He was bitterly disappointed, but after a couple of days the woman called him over. This gave him a glimmer of hope, so he finished up what he was doing, and he went over. She did indeed hand him some money. He thanked her and went back to where he slept, and that night gathered up all the money he had in the world. At supper, he put some food into a bag, claiming he was full and would keep the rest for later. This was all part of his master plan to get away from this hellhole. He waited until everyone was in bed and checked he had everything that he had foraged, crept out and grabbed a bike from the yard and started to cycle away from the farm. He cycled all the way back over the hills and dales until he arrived at Limerick train station. He used the money he had and bought a ticket and caught the train to Dublin. After he had abandoned the bicycle, he was ecstatic to eventually be free. When he arrived in Dublin, he wanted to travel on to Belfast, and again using the money he had tried to buy a ticket, but he hadn't enough money to pay for it. My father was distressed and couldn't believe what was happening. He hadn't eaten or anything, and it must have been the state he was in and his reaction. Somehow or other they let him go through, and he made his way to the Belfast train. He got on the fast train and landed in Belfast. He was full of anticipation, but didn't know how he was going to communicate. He wrote a note and started to ask some people if they knew where the Deaf Club was. Every person he approached shunned him, obviously because of the state he was in, unkempt and smelly, with a long beard and hair. Unfailing, he persisted. And then a lady gestured an affirmation and waved him to come to her. They walked together through the streets, and she pointed to a building. He went in. It was the Deaf Club, and in an instant he recognised a man, then another one and another. They were his friends from school. They couldn't take in his state or how this had happened, but they told him they would take care of him. That was in Bread Street, where the old club used to be. The building isn't there anymore. A deaf woman took him with her, and they wanted to know the backstory and how this had come to be. Father was starving, So they gave him some food and told him he should have a bath and loaned him some clothes to wear. They cut his long hair and beard. Once my father recounted what had happened, they were so proud of him for escaping. After a few days' recuperation, he started to look for a job. He asked around and got work as a window cleaner, working with John Carberry. John was a younger man than my father. They did their first job, and then the next, and when the time came, Dad got his pay. It was £5, which was a fortune compared to the measly 25p from the farmer. He was in heaven. That was his first job in Belfast for a few years, and then his life moved on from there. My sister Anne, who's hearing, taught me how to drive when I was age 18. I wasn't overly certain about driving, but she insisted, and she convinced me. I started to practice and could see myself improving over time. Then, on the 22nd of August, I bought myself a car. It was a Volkswagen car. That's right, a Volkswagen with a hump back. And after 66 years, there it is. Yes, it's still driving. And don't forget to mention that you were the first deaf lady driver in Northern Ireland. Yes, he's right. I was the first female deaf person to drive in Northern Ireland. Yes, the man told her. That's correct. Now there's lots of female lady drivers, but I was the first.